Somewhere in the middle of the Peruvian desert, there are lines carved into the earth that are so massive, so precise, that for nearly a century, nobody could explain how an ancient civilization without airplanes or drones managed to create them at all. Now, a new wave of artificial intelligence has been turned loose on this 2,000-year-old puzzle, and the patterns it is uncovering are making archaeologists rethink everything they thought they knew about who made these lines, why they made them, and what they were really trying to say. If you have ever seen a photo of the Nazca Lines from above, you already know how strange they look. Giant hummingbirds, spiders, monkeys, and geometric shapes stretch across the desert floor, some of them over 1,000 feet long, invisible from the ground, and only fully visible from the sky. For decades, the working theory was simple. The Nazca people, who lived in this region between roughly 200 BCE and 600 CE, scraped away the reddish-brown surface stones to reveal the lighter sand underneath, creating these giant drawings as offerings to their gods or markers for astronomical events. That explanation made sense on the surface, but it left a nagging question hanging in the air. If these lines were meant to be seen from above in a world with no flight, then who exactly were they for? The Nazca Lines were essentially rediscovered by accident. Commercial airplane pilots flying over the region in the 1920s and 1930s started reporting strange shapes carved into the desert floor, shapes that made no sense from the ground, but became the foundation of nearly every theory that followed, because it forced researchers to ask a question that still doesn't have a fully satisfying answer. If the Nazca people never flew, why build something designed to be understood from the sky? Some early researchers leaned toward wildly speculative explanations, including the idea that the lines were somehow connected to ancient visitors from beyond Earth, a theory that gained popularity in pop culture but was never taken seriously by mainstream archaeology. The far more grounded explanation, developed over decades of careful fieldwork, pointed toward astronomy, water rituals, and religious offerings, but even that explanation always felt incomplete because nobody had enough data to actually test it at scale. For most of the 20th century, researchers were limited to walking the desert on foot, squinting at faint depressions in the soil, and hoping they didn't miss a shape hidden by centuries of erosion. It was slow, painstaking work, and by the 2010s, the pace of new discoveries had started to stall. Scientists suspected there were more geoglyphs out there, but the ones that hadn't already been found were the faintest, most damaged, and hardest to detect with the human eye. That is exactly the kind of problem artificial intelligence is built to solve, and that is where this story really begins to pick up speed. A research team from Yamagata University in Japan, working alongside IBM, decided to train a deep learning model on thousands of high-resolution aerial images and satellite scans of the desert. The idea was simple in theory, but incredibly difficult in practice. Teach a machine to recognize the subtle soil contrasts, the faint outlines, and the almost invisible traces that a human researcher would likely walk right past without ever noticing. Months, the AI system flagged more than 300 previously unknown geoglyphs, a discovery so large it nearly doubled the entire known catalog of Nazca lines in one single sweep. To put that into perspective, it took nearly 100 years of human fieldwork to identify around 430 geoglyphs, and then an algorithm came along and found over 300 more in less time than it takes to finish a college semester. Archaeologists physically walked out into the desert to confirm each site the AI flagged, and time after time the machine was right. Among the new discoveries were things that genuinely unsettled researchers. There was a 72-foot-long depiction of what looks unmistakably like a killer whale gripping a knife, an image that lines up disturbingly well with ancient Nazca pottery showing orcas associated with human sacrifice. There were humanoid figures with strange, almost alien proportions. There were images believed to depict decapitated heads, tied to ritual ceremonies archaeologists already knew the Nazca practiced. This wasn't just a bigger pile of geoglyphs. It was a bigger, darker, more complicated picture of who the Nazca people actually were. Now, here is where the story takes the turn that has everyone talking. As advanced AI models have become more powerful and more publicly accessible, researchers and independent analysts alike have started experimenting with feeding the same kind of archaeological data into large-scale reasoning systems like Grok, the AI built by XAI. Unlike the narrow, purpose-built detection model used in the original Yamagata University study, models like Grok are designed to reason across enormous datasets, cross-reference historical records, satellite imagery, geological data, and even ancient texts all at once. When a system like that gets pointed at something as visually and historically layered as the Nazca Desert, it isn't just looking for shapes in the sand anymore. It is looking for relationships. It is looking for patterns that connect the geoglyphs to each other, to the landscape, and to the timeline of Nazca civilization itself, in ways that a narrower detection algorithm was never built to notice. It's also worth understanding just how differently these two kinds of AI systems actually work under the hood, because the difference explains why this newer phase of analysis feels like such a leap forward. The original Yamagata University model was trained the way most computer vision systems are trained, by showing it thousands of labeled examples of confirmed geoglyphs, until it learned to recognize the visual signature of a shape carved into the desert floor. That approach is incredibly effective at one narrow task and basically useless at anything outside that task. It can find a hidden hummingbird shape in a satellite image, but it has no understanding of Nazca history, no ability to reason about ritual practices, and no way to connect that hummingbird to a piece of pottery sitting in a museum on the other side of the world. Large reasoning models are built on a completely different foundation. They are trained on enormous, wide-ranging bodies of text, images, and data, which means they can move fluidly between a satellite photo, a translated academic paper on Nazca ceramics, and a geological survey of ancient water channels, drawing connections between all three in a single response. That flexibility is exactly what makes this new phase of investigation feel less like cataloging and more like genuine detective work. This is a crucial distinction, and it's worth slowing down on for a second. The original AI breakthrough was fundamentally a pattern recognition tool. Feed it enough labeled examples of what a geoglyph looks like against the desert floor, and it gets extremely good at spotting more of them, faster than any human ever could. But a large reasoning model approaches the problem completely differently. Instead of just asking, is this a geoglyph? It can be asked, why are these geoglyphs clustered the way they are? Or what astronomical alignments exist between this figure and the solstice points visible from this exact location? Or does the placement of these figures correlate with ancient water sources, trade routes, or ceremonial pathways? Those are the kinds of questions that used to take archaeologists years of cross-referencing paper maps and field notes to even attempt. Now they can be explored computationally in a fraction of the time, and the desert has responded with details that are reshaping the conversation. One of the most talked about threads to come out of this newer wave of analysis involves the spatial relationships between the figurative geoglyphs, the ones depicting animals and humanoid shapes, and the long, straight geometric lines that stretch for miles across the plateau. For years, these two categories of lines were often studied somewhat separately, treated almost like two different art forms from two different purposes. But when broader AI analysis is applied across the full dataset, including the newly discovered geoglyphs, a striking pattern starts to emerge. The figurative images tend to cluster near ancient footpaths and points that would have been walked by real people, while the massive geometric lines seem to radiate outward like a network, connecting distant points across the desert in ways that suggest deliberate planning at a scale far beyond a single generation of artists. That kind of large-scale coordination implies something researchers have long suspected but struggled to prove. This wasn't random rituals scattered across centuries. This may have been closer to a coordinated, ongoing project passed down and expanded through generations of Nazca people, almost like a slowly built monument that the entire culture kept adding to over hundreds of years. There is also the darker thread running through this newer analysis, the one connected to the killer whale with a knife and the decapitated head imagery. When these figures are matching, the connections are startlingly consistent. The Nazca left behind detailed pottery showing orca-like beings associated with taking human heads, and now nearly identical imagery is showing up carved into the earth itself, on a scale that would have made it visible to anyone or anything looking down from above. Some researchers who have raised the idea that these particular geoglyphs may not have been made purely for spiritual offering in the abstract sense. They may have functioned as a kind of permanent physical record of specific historical events or ceremonies, essentially the Nazca equivalent of carving a monument to a real ritual that actually took place, rather than simply an artistic tribute to a god they never expected anyone to physically witness from the sky. There is another layer to this that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, and it involves water. The Nazca region is one of the driest places on the planet, and survival there depended entirely on a remarkable system of underground aqueducts the Nazca people built to channel scarce water across the desert. When AI-assisted mapping overlaid the newly discovered geoglyphs against the known locations of these ancient aqueducts, a pattern emerged that many researchers found genuinely striking. A significant number of the figurative geoglyphs sit near these water channels, almost as if they were meant to mark, bless, or ceremonially protect the very system that kept the Nazca civilization alive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. That single connection reframes the entire conversation. These lines may not have simply been abstract offerings to distant gods watching from the sky. They may have been deeply practical, tied directly to the most urgent life-or-death concern any desert civilization faces, which is making sure the water keeps flowing. And that brings us to the question that has kept people obsessed with the Nazca Lines for 100 years and counting. Why make something so enormous that the only way to know human being of that era could have reached? This is where things get genuinely fascinating, because the newer AI-assisted analysis hasn't found a single tidy answer. Instead, it has strengthened multiple competing explanations at once, each backed by data in a way that older, more limited research methods simply couldn't achieve. The astronomical alignment theory has gained fresh support, with several of the newly mapped lines showing measurable alignment to solstice and equinox points on the horizon, matching a pattern first proposed decades ago by researcher Maria Reiche, but never confirmed across this many geoglyphs at once. At the same time, the ritual pathway theory has also gained ground, with AI-mapped foot traffic patterns, suggesting that many lines were walked repeatedly, not just viewed, meaning the experience of the lines from ground level, moving along them in a slow procession, may have mattered just as much as their appearance from above. What makes this moment different from every previous chapter of Nazca research isn't that AI suddenly solved the mystery. It hasn't. What makes it different is the sheer scale and speed at which competing theories can now be tested against a dataset 3 times larger than what researchers had access to just a few years ago. Before this wave of AI-assisted discovery, scientists were essentially trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with a third of the pieces missing. Now they have most of the picture in front of them, and the shape that's emerging is more complex, more intentional, and honestly, a little more unsettling than the simplified story most people learned about ancient stargazers drawing pictures in the sand. There's also a broader story unfolding here that goes far beyond one desert in Peru, and it's worth pausing on before we go further. The same AI techniques being applied to the Nazca Lines are now being pointed at burial mounds in Europe, forgotten settlements buried under jungle canopy, and shipwrecks scattered across ocean floors that human divers have never been able to systematically search. Archaeology as a field has quietly entered a phase where the limiting factor isn't how many ruins are left to find, it's how fast researchers can process the overwhelming amount of satellite, drone, and sensor data already sitting in storage, some of it collected years or even decades ago and never fully analyzed by human eyes. One archaeologist involved in this kind of AI-assisted work described the current period as a genuine turning point for the entire discipline, and it's easy to see why. For the first time, the technology exists to comb through terabytes of imagery in months instead of lifetimes, and the Nazca Lines happen to be one of the most visually dramatic proving grounds for just how much this can change. Of course, none of this comes without a serious note of caution, and any honest look at this story has to include it. Archaeologists working directly with these AI systems have been careful to point out that a machine flagging a pattern is not the same thing as confirming a genuine ancient structure. Soil erosion, modern agriculture, old roads, and even accidental animal trails can create shapes that look deceptively similar to intentional geoglyphs from a satellite image. That is exactly why every single AI-flagged location in the original Yamagata University study was physically walked and verified on the ground by human researchers before being added to the official record. The same caution applies, arguably even more so, when broader reasoning models like Grok are used to spot larger patterns and connections across the dataset. A machine can absolutely tell you that 2 things appear statistically related. It takes a trained archaeologist, cross-referencing historical records, radiocarbon dating, and physical excavation to tell you whether that relationship is real, coincidental, or simply an artifact of how the data was structured in the first place. Still, even with that necessary caution built in, it's hard to overstate how much this changes the trajectory of Nazca research going forward. For 100 years, our understanding of these lines crept forward one discovery at a time, often decades apart, limited by how much ground a small team of researchers could physically cover on foot. In the span of just a few years, that number has exploded, and the newer wave of AI-assisted reasoning is now allowing researchers to ask bigger, more ambitious questions about the culture behind these lines rather than just cataloging individual shapes one by one. Instead of simply asking, what is this geoglyph, the conversation has shifted toward, what does the full network of geoglyphs tell us about how an entire civilization organized itself, worshipped, remembered its history, and passed down knowledge across generations without a written language in the way we typically define one? That last point deserves its own moment because it might be the single most important shift happening in Nazca research right now. The Nazca people did not leave behind a written language the way the Maya or the Egyptians did. For a long time, that meant huge parts of their belief system, their political structure, and their history were essentially locked away, accessible only through pottery, textiles, and burial sites. But if these geoglyphs really do function as a kind of large-scale visual record, a way of encoding real ceremonies, real events, and real cultural values directly into the landscape itself, then AI-assisted analysis may be handing researchers something close to a decoder for a civilization that never wrote a single word down. That is an enormous claim, and it is still very much being debated within the archaeological community, but it's exactly The kind of claim that becomes testable piece by piece now that the full scale of the dataset is finally within reach. Before we go any further, if this kind of story is the kind of thing you find genuinely fascinating, do us a favor and hit that like button. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive like this one. So where does this actually leave us? The honest answer is that the Nazca Lines are in some ways more mysterious now than they were before all this AI-assisted analysis began, not less. Every new geoglyph that gets confirmed adds another data point, and every new data point seems to open up 2 or 3 new questions instead of closing the case. We now know there are more lines, more figures, and more apparent intentionality behind their placement than anyone estimated just a decade ago. We know the imagery connects to real ritual practices documented on pottery and textiles, including some genuinely dark ones involving depicted violence and sacrifice. We know the geometric lines appear to radiate across the desert in patterns that suggest coordinated long-term planning rather than isolated acts of artistic expression. And we know that as more advanced reasoning systems get applied to this same dataset, researchers keep finding fresh threads connecting astronomy, ritual movement, water sources, and ceremonial pathways in ways the original discoverers of these lines back in the 1920s could never have imagined possible. There's also a human side to this story that tends to get lost once the headlines focus purely on the technology. Behind every single one of those 300-plus AI-flagged locations was a real researcher, hiking out into brutal desert heat, GPS coordinates in hand, to physically confirm whether a shape the algorithm spotted from orbit was actually there in the sand. That partnership between machine and human is really the heart of this entire story, and it's probably the model for how most future archaeological discoveries will unfold. The AI does the impossible part, scanning terabytes of imagery no human team could realistically review in a lifetime, and the human experts do the part no machine can replace, walking the ground, reading the soil, and applying decades of contextual knowledge about a culture that speaks to us now only through what it left behind in stone, clay, and sand. What's genuinely exciting, and a little bit eerie if you sit with it long enough, is that we may only be scratching the surface of what this data can actually reveal. The same desert that took 100 years to give up 430 of its secrets has now handed over hundreds more in a matter of months, simply because we finally built the right tool to ask it the right questions. And if the last few years are any indication of where this is headed, the next wave of discoveries, whether they come from Grok, from purpose-built detection models, or from whatever comes after them, may not just add more shapes to the map. They may finally start answering the question that has haunted this desert for a century. Not just what these lines are, but why an ancient civilization went to such extraordinary lengths to make sure something or someone would eventually be able to look down and see them. That question has waited 100 years for an answer, and for the first time, we may finally have the tools to actually find one.